Sheree Miller. What happens when the digital world becomes a weapon? When pixels and passwords turn into tools for manipulation? In 1999, the internet was still new enough that most people saw it as harmless entertainment, a place for simple conversations and casual connections. But for one woman in Michigan, it became something far more dangerous. A place where she could craft lies, spin fantasies, and orchestrate something unthinkable. Sheree Miller appeared to have everything under control. In April of 1999, Sheree Miller married Bruce Miller in a Las Vegas wedding chapel, just 4 months after she began working as a bookkeeper at his auto salvage yard in Flint, Michigan. Bruce was a quiet, twice-divorced man in his late 40s who loved NASCAR and was looking forward to retirement. Sheree was 26, vivacious, a mother of 3 from previous relationships, and someone who seemed to bring energy wherever she went. Their 20-year age difference raised some eyebrows, but Bruce appeared content. He had found someone who made him feel young again, someone who seemed to appreciate the life he had built. He could not have known that his new wife had already begun constructing an alternate reality, one where he would not live to see the year 2000. Within months of their marriage, Sheree had discovered AOL chat rooms. She later admitted she barely left the computer, spending hours engaging with strangers while Bruce worked long days at the salvage yard. Among the screen names she used were handles that left little to the imagination about her intentions. It was in these digital spaces that she encountered Jerry Cassidy, a former homicide investigator from Kansas City, Missouri. Cassidy was in emotional freefall. His career in law enforcement had imploded after workplace conflicts and an injury that led to prescription medication dependency. His marriage had collapsed. By the time Sheree found him, he was working at a casino in Reno, Nevada, trying to piece together whatever remained of his life. She saw an opportunity. Their instant messages quickly evolved from friendly conversation to something far more intimate. Cassidy fell completely under her spell, telling his mother that Sheree was the woman of his dreams. But Sheree was not simply looking for companionship. She was constructing a narrative, one that would require her new online companion to play a very specific role. She began telling Cassidy that Bruce was abusive, sending him photographs that appeared to show bruises on her body. Investigators would later theorize these marks were created with cosmetics, part of an elaborate performance designed to elicit sympathy and rage in equal measure. Then came the pregnancy claims. Sheree sent Cassidy what she claimed were positive pregnancy tests and photographs of her expanding belly, telling him he was going to be a father. She later confessed she simply pushed her stomach out, knowing Cassidy wanted to believe so desperately that he would see what was not there. The deception went further. She told him Bruce had discovered the pregnancy and beaten her so severely that she lost the baby. She repeated this performance with a second fake pregnancy, each fictional tragedy deepening Cassidy's fury toward a man he had never met. She convinced him that Bruce was not just abusive but connected to organized crime, that her life was in danger, that something had to be done. The planning happened in plain text. Their instant messages, recovered later from Cassidy's computer, contained precise instructions. They discussed timing, method, location. One recovered exchange showed Sheree giving directions, and Cassidy responding with questions about whether she could live with what was about to happen. Her response was chilling in its simplicity. She could. On November 8, 1999, at a rest area before the murder, Sheree handed Cassidy her cell phone and delivered the final instructions. That evening, Bruce Miller was shot in the neck and upper back while working in the office of his salvage yard. The signal came shortly after. A single ring on Sheree's landline, then silence. Cassidy was on his way back to Missouri. Police initially focused on John Hutchinson, a former employee who had borrowed money from Bruce and failed a polygraph examination. The case seemed straightforward until February 2000, when authorities in Missouri received a call from an attorney. Jerry Cassidy had taken his own life, leaving behind a briefcase filled with evidence and a note confessing to the murder while implicating Sheree in the conspiracy. The briefcase contained everything: flight records, hotel receipts, printed instant messages, even videos Sheree had sent. It was, as one investigator noted, a complete case assembled by someone who understood how investigations worked. When authorities confronted Sheree, she initially denied everything, then claimed the messages had been hacked, the evidence tampered with. On December 22, 2000, after 2 days of deliberation, a jury found her guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. She received a sentence of life in prison plus 54 to 81 years. Sheree Miller remains behind bars today, her case standing as a landmark in legal history as one of the first major trials to grapple with digital evidence and internet conspiracy. She eventually admitted her role, telling interviewers, "The truth was worse than greed." Bruce was close to discovering who she really was. For Jerry Cassidy, a broken man seeking connection, that realization came too late. For Bruce Miller, it never came at all. Adriana Vasco. When we speak of romantic relationships turning dark, we often imagine heated arguments, jealous rages, crimes committed in moments of passion. But what do we call it when romance becomes a transaction? When affection transforms into currency? When the man who trusts you with his darkest desires becomes just another pawn on a chessboard where pieces are eliminated not through strategy, but through a revolver at point-blank range on a desolate highway? Kenneth Stoll was a prominent osteopathic physician and anesthesiologist in Huntington Beach, California, a man whose outward success masked a deeply troubled private life. He had been married to Carolyn Opie Stoll, an optometrist, for 14 years. Their home in an upscale neighborhood spoke of achievement, their dual medical careers suggested partnership, and to neighbors, they represented the California professional dream. But Ken had spent years cultivating relationships with other women, including one that would eventually consume everyone it touched. For 9 years, Ken maintained a secret relationship with Adriana Vasco, a medical secretary who had once worked as a receptionist in his office. What began as workplace flirtation evolved into something far more tangled, a connection where professional boundaries dissolved and the line between employer and lover became dangerously blurred. According to investigators and those who knew Adriana, she possessed a particular gift: the ability to navigate through life by using people, particularly men. She was street smart, adept at reading what others wanted, and positioning herself as the answer to those wants. For Ken, she was the escape from a marriage that had become suffocating. For Ken, who spoke openly to friends about his growing resentment toward Carolyn, divorce seemed like the logical solution. But divorce meant complexity, financial entanglement, the public unraveling of a carefully constructed image. Though Ken and Carolyn had signed a prenuptial agreement that would have protected him financially in a divorce, he apparently sought a different path entirely. Investigators later learned that Ken had approached Richard Anaya, an electrician and former gang member, approximately a year before the murders, asking if he knew anyone who would take care of my wife. Anaya declined. But Adriana was seeing someone else by this point, another layer of complication in an already convoluted web. Dennis Earl Godley was a maintenance worker in her apartment building, an ex-convict with a lengthy criminal record who, during casual conversation over drinks, mentioned he belonged to a group of hired assailants. Rather than being frightened by this revelation, Adriana told Godley she knew a doctor who wanted his wife eliminated. The pieces were falling into place. Ken agreed to pay $30,000 for Carolyn's removal from his life. In early November of 1999, Ken withdrew $20,000 in cash from his checking account, an unusual transaction that left no corresponding expense in his records. Around the same time, Adriana appeared at work, wearing new jewelry, claiming Godley's wealthy parents had sent him money. Investigators would later confirm this was fiction. On November 20th, 1999, Ken and Carolyn went to a restaurant to celebrate her 44th birthday. They had no idea this ordinary celebration would be their final shared experience. Around 10 p.m., a security officer discovered their car parked near a call box on a desolate stretch of the Ortega Highway. The engine was still running, the passenger door hung open, and both Ken and Carolyn had been shot at close range with a revolver. They had been struck at least 10 times, the shooter taking time to reload and fire again. 3 days after the murders, police noticed multiple phone calls between Ken and Adriana on the day of the shootings. When questioned, she denied having an affair with Ken, claiming they were simply friends since 1992. But her supervisor revealed Adriana had described a long-term dating relationship with Ken, and that she was simultaneously involved with someone named Tony, saying both men knew about each other and had no problem with the arrangement. The investigation intensified. Dennis Godley was eventually located at a mobile home park in North Carolina. In December of 2000, just over a year after the murders, authorities charged both Adriana Vasco and Dennis Godley with 2 counts of murder. Adriana eventually confessed that Ken had approached her about having Carolyn killed, and that she recruited Godley for the job. She claimed she sat in the car during the attack, hearing Carolyn scream, and that Godley then unexpectedly turned the weapon on Ken as well, telling her afterwards he eliminated a witness. At trial in November 2002, Adriana was found guilty of first-degree murder for Carolyn's death and second-degree murder for Ken's death, along with special circumstances, including lying in wait and multiple murder. In January 2003, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dennis Godley pleaded guilty and received the same sentence. In a twist in June 2004, Godley claimed through his attorney that he only killed Ken, and that Adriana was the one who actually shot Carolyn. As of today, Adriana Vasco remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Her case serves as a haunting examination of manipulation taken to its furthest extreme, where relationships became weapons, where trust was currency, and where 3 lives were extinguished on a dark highway because divorce papers seemed too complicated to sign. Crystal Lee. There's a difference between standing beside someone you love and standing in their shadow while they commit the unthinkable. But what about when you don't just stand there? What about when you drive 12 hours through the night, armed with bleach and cleaning supplies, ready to scrub away another woman's existence from the walls and floors of her own home? What about when you watch flames consume a body you never harmed but did nothing to protect? At what point does silence become complicity, and complicity become guilt? These are not abstract ethical questions. They are the real dilemma at the heart of Crystal Lee's story. A woman who claimed she was paralyzed by fear yet somehow found the strength to make 3 separate trips to Colorado, each time knowing exactly what her lover wanted her to do. Crystal Lee met Patrick Frazee at a county dance in 2006 when she was 20 years old. She described him as tall and handsome, someone who seemed to have direction in his life. They dated for months before geography pulled them apart when she returned to Idaho. But the connection, at least for Crystal, never truly severed. They broke up in August 2007, but maintained contact, that peculiar modern phenomenon where relationships end but never quite disappear. In 2008, Frazee offered her a border collie puppy, and she made the drive to Colorado to collect it. She later admitted she still had feelings for him then, feelings strong enough that when he demanded she choose between him and another man she was dating, she left with the dog and chose the other path. Months later, Frazee told her she needed to return the dog or pay for it, and when she refused, He threatened to drive to Idaho and harm the animal. The dog survived, but their communication ceased. They would not speak again until the day before her wedding to Chad Lee in 2010. By 2018, Crystal was divorced and had reconnected with Frazee when she traveled to Colorado. By this time, he was engaged to Kelsey Bereth, a 29-year-old flight instructor, and they shared a daughter named Kaylee. Crystal later claimed she was kept in the dark about his engagement until June 2018. When she learned the truth, something shifted. Frazee began telling her Kelsey was abusive, claiming Bereth would harm the baby, even hitting her with an iron. Authorities could find no evidence whatsoever that Bereth had ever harmed her child. The lies were designed to do one thing: transform a woman Crystal had never met into a threat that needed removing. The planning began in September 2018. Frazee instructed Crystal to purchase a burner phone. There were 3 separate attempts, 3 times when Crystal drove from Idaho to Colorado with the stated purpose of ending Kelsey Bereth's life. The first scheme involved a Starbucks coffee, specifically a caramel macchiato, Kelsey's favorite drink. Frazee, knowing Crystal worked as a nurse, discussed prescription medications he believed she could access, telling her to lace the drink. In September 2018, Crystal knocked on Kelsey's door one evening, pretending to be a new neighbor offering coffee. When Kelsey answered without makeup, looking guarded and standoffish in the darkness, she told Crystal she didn't know what she was talking about, but accepted the coffee anyway before closing the door. Crystal had not added anything to the drink. The next day, Frazee called her, asking why Kelsey was still alive. There was a second plan involving a metal pipe that Frazee loaned to her. She returned it unused. A third attempt also ended without action. Each time, Crystal drove hundreds of miles with full knowledge of what was being asked of her. Each time, she stopped short of the final act. In exchange for her testimony, prosecutors would exempt her from charges related to these 3 failed conspiracies. Had she been charged with attempted murder for any of them, she could have faced decades behind bars. On November 22, 2018, Thanksgiving Day, Crystal was having dinner with her family in Twin Falls, Idaho, when she saw a missed call from Frazee. When she returned the call, he told her she needed to come to Colorado. She had to work an on-call shift at the hospital where she worked, so she arranged to exchange cars with a friend. She loaded the vehicle with cleaning supplies from her home, including a bodysuit and foot covers she had used while painting, and began the 12-hour drive to Woodland Park. She arrived during the morning of November 24th. What she encountered inside Kelsey Bereth's home was a scene of severe violence. There were visible stains on the floor and walls and signs of a struggle through multiple rooms. Crystal later testified she stood at the door for a moment, realizing it was worse than she had imagined, thinking nobody else needed to see this. She began scrubbing with the bleach she had brought, then used Kelsey's own cleaning supplies. It took 4 hours. She later claimed she intentionally left small amounts of blood on a fireplace and a baby gate, hoping investigators would find them. According to Crystal's testimony, Frazee told her he had blindfolded Kelsey with a sweater and asked her to smell candles to guess their scents. While she was blindfolded, he struck her repeatedly. After the attack, Frazee placed her body in a black tote. 2 days after the cleanup, Crystal met Frazee at his ranch in Florissant and watched as he burned the tote containing Kelsey's remains. She took Kelsey's phone with her when she returned to Idaho and destroyed it along the way, sending texts from it to Frazee and Kelsey's employer to mislead investigators. When law enforcement initially questioned her, Crystal gave vague answers and outright lies. She claimed she had gone to Bereth's home to look at a horse on November 24th. Cell phone records showed she was lying about her whereabouts. Eventually, facing overwhelming data, she agreed to cooperate. On November 18, 2019, Patrick Frazee was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole plus additional years. On January 28, 2020, Crystal Lee received the maximum sentence allowed under her plea agreement, 3 years in prison. In court, Kelsey's mother, Cheryl Bereth, called Crystal an active participant in the murder. The only thing she didn't do was swing the bat. The prosecutor acknowledged the arrangement was not justice for Crystal Lee, calling it a deal with the devil, but maintained it secured justice for Kelsey. Crystal was released on parole on March 23, 2021, after serving the mandatory release date. She remained in Colorado for at least a year under parole supervision before returning to private life. Crystal Lee's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about agency, fear, and moral responsibility. She drove across state lines 3 times, each trip a decision point where she could have contacted authorities. She cleaned a crime scene for hours, erasing another woman's final moments. She watched a body burn, yet she claimed throughout that she was terrified of Frazee. The question that haunts this case is not whether fear can make people do terrible things. The question is, at what point does fear stop being an explanation and become an excuse? Michelle Boat. There is something deeply unsettling about the collapse of a marriage. Not just the end of vows or the splitting of assets, but the quiet unraveling of a person's sense of self. For 2 decades, you defined yourself by a partnership. Then one day, without warning, that definition dissolves. The person who promised forever walks away, and you are left asking, who am I now? Some people grieve and rebuild, others retreat into bitterness and regret. But what happens when someone refuses to accept the ending at all? What happens when rejection transforms into obsession? When heartbreak becomes a justification? When the person who replaced you in someone's affections stops being human and becomes simply an obstacle to be removed? Tracy Mondebeau was a 46-year-old mother of 4 from Ottumwa, Iowa, whose life changed dramatically in February of 2020 when she accidentally sent a friend request on Facebook to a man named Nicholas Boat. They went on their first date on March 8th, and their connection was immediate and intense enough that within weeks they had moved in together. For Tracy, recently divorced and raising her children, this felt like a second chance at happiness. For Nicholas, who had recently separated from his wife Michelle after 20 years of marriage, it represented the possibility of starting over. But for Michelle Boat, Nicholas's estranged wife, Tracy's very existence represented something far darker, the woman who had stolen her life. By March of 2020, Michelle's behavior toward Tracy had already escalated to the point where Tracy felt compelled to contact authorities. She reported to police that Michelle had followed her from Pella to Ottumwa, a distance of some 40 miles, and that she was so frightened she asked officers to meet her at a gas station. The pattern was established early. Michelle was not simply grieving her marriage. She was actively monitoring Tracy's movements, tracking her relationship with Nicholas, refusing to accept that her husband had chosen someone else. The separation had occurred in March, just as Nicholas and Tracy's relationship was beginning. In Michelle's mind, the connection was obvious and unforgivable. If Tracy disappeared, perhaps Nicholas would return. Michelle later testified at her trial that she was destroyed and devastated when her husband of 20 years left her for Tracy. Her defense team argued she suffered from deep loneliness and stress during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, after she and Nicholas separated, that the isolation and heartbreak had pushed her to a breaking point. But what prosecutors would reveal was not a woman broken by grief, but a woman consumed by jealous rage, someone who had been planning, watching, waiting for an opportunity. May 18th, 2020 began as an ordinary Monday evening in Pella, Iowa. Surveillance footage from that day would later show Michelle following Tracy from a Burger King drive-through to Nicholas's workplace at Vermeer Corporation. She watched as Nicholas and Tracy shared a meal together, watched them kiss, then followed Tracy's pickup truck as she left the parking lot and drove back to the apartment complex on Glenwood Street where she lived with Nicholas. The surveillance videos captured Michelle's gray Cadillac trailing Tracy's vehicle over several miles, a patient and deliberate pursuit. At approximately 8:21 that evening, Pella police received a call reporting a possible domestic dispute in the alleyway behind 101 Glenwood Street. A caller told dispatchers they had heard someone yell, "He don't belong to you," during what appeared to be a fight between two women. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Tracy slumped in her vehicle, still wearing her seat belt. She had been attacked so quickly after parking that she had not even had time to unbuckle herself. Despite officers performing immediate life-saving measures, Tracy was pronounced gone at the scene. The wounds to her body indicated she had been stabbed, including a puncture wound to her chest and defensive lacerations on her hands where she had tried to fight back. Clutched in Tracy's hand was a handful of hair that DNA testing would later confirm belonged to Michelle. Shortly after discovering Tracy's body, police went to Michelle's home where they observed a gray four-door Cadillac parked outside with visible traces of what appeared to be substance on the exterior. The car's engine and rotors were still warm to the touch. When Michelle answered the door, she was wearing a robe with her hair wrapped in a towel and told officers she had just been taking a shower. When police searched her home, they discovered her clothes already in the washing machine and a pair of latex gloves with what appeared to be substance on them, hidden in the upper tank of the toilet in the bathroom. Michelle was arrested that night for violating a no-contact order that had been issued to protect both Nicholas and Tracy. The following day, authorities amended the charges to include one count of first-degree murder. When Michelle's trial began in May of 2021, her defense attorney made an unusual admission in opening statements. The attorney acknowledged Michelle had ended Tracy's life, but argued the jury should convict her of the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder. Michelle took the stand in her own defense, becoming emotional as she testified that she had simply snapped when confronting Tracy, that she grabbed a knife and attacked in what she claimed was an uncontrolled moment of passion. Prosecutors painted a completely different picture. A woman who had stalked Tracy for an hour that evening, who had come prepared with latex gloves and a weapon, who had attacked Tracy so swiftly she could not even remove her seatbelt to defend herself. The prosecution argued that Michelle's claim about wearing latex gloves because of COVID-19 concerns was simply too convenient, that the gloves were worn to avoid leaving behind fingerprints or other identifying traces. They also presented a voicemail Michelle had left for Nicholas several months before the attack in which she warned that Tracy had messed with the wrong mama. After hearing 3 days of testimony and closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 1 hour before returning a unanimous verdict of guilty on first-degree murder. Michelle was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution. Her appeal was denied by the Iowa Court of Appeals in February of 2024. Michelle Boat remains incarcerated today at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville, Iowa. Her case stands as a reminder that the end of a relationship, no matter how painful, is never justification for taking a life. Tracy Mondabeau was a mother, a grandmother, someone who had found unexpected happiness in the midst of her own life's transitions. She deserved the chance to live that happiness. Instead, she became the target of someone who could not distinguish between grief and entitlement, between heartbreak and ownership. Samantha Scott. Loyalty is supposed to be one of humanity's most admirable qualities. We celebrate it in friendships. We demand it in marriages. We build entire moral systems around the concept of standing by those we care about. But what happens when loyalty becomes complicity? What happens when standing by someone means standing beside them as they cross the most fundamental line a person can cross? And how do we understand a woman who, even after learning the truth about what the man she loved had done, chose not to turn away but to turn toward him, allowing affection to eclipse every other moral consideration? Samantha Scott was 33 years old when she was arrested alongside Daniel Serafini in October of 2023. At the time of the June 5, 2021 incident that would eventually lead to their arrests, Scott was the best friend of Serafini's wife Erin Spohr and an occasional babysitter for the couple's two young boys. She was someone the family trusted completely, someone who was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. She knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, their family dynamics. And she was the person Daniel Serafini chose to accompany him on what would become one of the darkest days in that family's history. Gary Spohr was 70 years old, a successful businessman who had built a life of considerable wealth with his wife Wendy Wood at their $3.5 million home in Homewood, California, near Lake Tahoe. They were the kind of couple who had worked hard, accumulated significant assets, and were now enjoying retirement together. They doted on their grandchildren, spending time with them on the lake, building memories that should have lasted for years to come. But Daniel Serafini, their son-in-law and a former Major League Baseball pitcher, had other plans. Prosecutors would later argue he carried out the attack after years of financial struggles, following the end of his baseball career, which had itself ended in disgrace when he was suspended for 50 games in 2007 after testing positive for performance-enhancing substances. On June 5, 2021, Scott drove Serafini from their area to Lake Tahoe, a journey that required spending the previous night at a motel in Elko, Nevada. Surveillance footage from that motel would later show both of them there together. Scott would later testify under oath that she believed Serafini was making the trip to purchase a large quantity of controlled substances and had no idea he planned to harm his in-laws. It was a claim she would repeat consistently, even as evidence mounted that suggested a far more aware and willing participation. Security video from a residence about 1.5 miles from the Spohr home showed someone identified as Samantha Scott parking a tan Subaru and walking around the block. Prosecutors presented evidence that Serafini had dropped himself off near the victim's home, then entered the residence in the middle of the day, while Gary and Wendy were out on their boat with Erin and their two young grandchildren. He waited. For hours, he waited inside that home, knowing exactly when they would return, knowing exactly what he intended to do. At 8:51 p.m., 6 gunshots were heard on security video. 4 minutes later, the same figure was seen leaving the home. Gary Spohr was found deceased in his living room from a gunshot wound. Wendy Wood had been shot twice in the head at point-blank range, but somehow, impossibly, survived. Security footage showed Scott picking up Serafini after the attack. The most damning part of Samantha Scott's story, however, was not what happened on that June evening. It was what happened afterward. Cell phone records revealed Scott had been near the Homewood residence on the day of the attack. While Serafini had turned his cell phone off that day, despite typically sending upwards of 100 text messages daily, Scott did not turn off her phone, allowing investigators to place her just over 1 mile from the scene. In November of 2021, when investigators executed a search warrant at her home and confronted her about being near the crime scene, Serafini confessed to her that he had shot Wendy Wood twice in the head at point-blank range. This is where Samantha Scott's choices become almost incomprehensible to anyone observing from the outside. Rather than immediately going to authorities with this information, rather than expressing horror at what the man she had driven to Lake Tahoe had done, Scott started an affair with the married father just a few months later. She continued the relationship with Serafini even after he allegedly confessed to the attack, and after she herself was arrested and charged alongside him. What's more, Scott continued to lie and deny that Serafini had any involvement even after he allegedly confessed to committing the act. The affair was conducted with remarkable audacity, with the two disguising their intimate meetings as trips to the home improvement store Lowe's. Text messages submitted as evidence during the trial showed Serafini writing to Scott, "Hey, thanks for letting us use your car. I'm headed to Lowe's in a minute. You need anything? And I'm going to Lowe's tomorrow, so be ready." This was how they communicated about their secret relationship, carrying it on while Erin Spohr, still unaware of what her husband had done and that her best friend had helped him do it, continued to stand by her husband's side. The family's pain only deepened. Despite surviving the attack and pushing through a difficult recovery, Wendy Wood later passed away due in part to the emotional toll of the events and the loss of her husband. As her daughter Adrienne later explained, "As her brain healed, the heartbreak of losing my dad and knowing who was responsible became too much. She used to say she felt like she had lost her right arm." On February 6, 2025, Samantha Scott pleaded guilty to a felony violation of being an accessory to a crime. She agreed to testify against Serafini in a deal with prosecutors that allowed her to avoid being tried on the same charges as him. During Serafini's 6-week trial in July of 2025, Scott testified about the confession he had made to her. On July 14, 2025, a jury convicted Daniel Serafini of 1 count of taking a life and 1 count of attempted harm. He now faces the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. Samantha Scott is currently no longer in custody and awaits sentencing at a future date. Her case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of complicity and the choices we make when confronted with someone else's wrongdoing. She was not the one who pulled the trigger, but she drove the car. She kept the secret. And when she learned the truth, she chose romance over responsibility, affection over accountability. In doing so, she became something more than a passive observer and something less than an active participant, occupying that murky moral space where loyalty transforms into betrayal of everything decent. Nanette Johnston. There's an old saying that you can judge people by the company they keep, but what about the company they discard? Nanette Johnston moved through relationships like chapters in a book, each one opening with promise and closing with something darker. She married, she divorced, she met wealthy men through personal ads. She built new lives and then abandoned them when better opportunities appeared. But in December 1994, one of those opportunities led to something she couldn't walk away from. A relationship ended not with a breakup, but with someone losing their life. Nanette was a single mother of 2 when she met 55-year-old Bill McLaughlin through a magazine advertisement. He was a wealthy healthcare entrepreneur who had recently gone through a divorce after 24 years of marriage. McLaughlin had made his fortune creating medical devices, and by the time Nanette entered his world, he was worth more than $20 million. Within a few months, she and her children moved into his 6-bedroom home in a gated Newport Beach community. To outsiders, it looked like a fairy tale. An older, successful man providing stability for a younger woman and her family. She began managing his personal financial affairs. He made her the beneficiary of a $1 million life insurance policy and named her trustee of a trust containing the bulk of his assets. She was engaged to him. She appeared happy. But appearances can be deceiving, can't they? How often do we see only what people want us to see? While living with McLaughlin, Nanette met Eric Naposki, a former NFL linebacker. The affair began quietly, conducted in secret, while she continued living in Bill's home and spending his money. Days after the incident, Police surveillance units saw Johnston and Naposki at one of McLaughlin's beach properties, decorating a Christmas tree and acting like a couple. The relationship had been going on for some time, and Bill McLaughlin had no idea. Meanwhile, Nanette had been embezzling money from Bill's accounts. The day before his passing, she wrote a check for $250,000 from one of his accounts and deposited it into her own. The financial motive was becoming clear. But money wasn't the only complication. If Bill discovered the affair, if he found out about the stolen funds, everything she had built would disappear. Divorce would mean losing access to his wealth. So what was the solution? On December 15, 1994, William McLaughlin was found with multiple wounds in the kitchen of his Newport Beach home. His disabled son, who was upstairs at the time, heard the commotion and discovered his father. There was no weapon left at the scene, no fingerprints, no clear suspect. The case seemed impossible to solve. Nanette and Eric Naposki were questioned but not arrested in 1995. Johnston pleaded guilty in 1996 to forgery and grand theft for stealing from McLaughlin's accounts and served a year in jail. Then, she moved on with her life. According to investigators, she married and had another child within 8 years. 7 years after that marriage, she married again and had yet another child, essentially reinventing herself as a doting wife and soccer mom. Meanwhile, Naposki had also gotten married and started over on the East Coast. For 15 years, the case went cold. Then in 2008, a cold case investigator at the Orange County District Attorney's Office began reviewing the file. A breakthrough came when investigators identified a witness who had years earlier provided anonymous information. She knew both Johnston and Naposki and revealed that the former football player had spoken about wanting to harm someone named Bill. In May 2009, 15 years after the incident, both Nanette and Eric were arrested. They had long since broken up. Each was living a completely different life. During their separate trials, each defense attempted to pin the crime on the other. Johnston's counsel said Naposki acted alone out of jealousy, while Naposki's lawyers claimed Johnston masterminded the entire plot. On July 14, 2011, Eric Naposki was found guilty. On January 23, 2012, Nanette Johnston was also found guilty. On May 18, 2012, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, at age 56, she is incarcerated and spends her time training service dogs through a prison program. The woman who once moved effortlessly between relationships and reinvented herself repeatedly now faces a future where reinvention is no longer possible. Donna Somerville. Sometimes the person who arrives to ease suffering becomes the architect of it. In the summer of 1990, Donna Scott entered the Somerville household as a hospice nurse, caring for Hamilton Somerville's wife Sydney, who was losing her battle with breast cancer. She was there to provide comfort in those final days. She was there to help her family navigate grief. But when Sydney passed away in September 1990, Donna remained in the home to care for Hamilton's mother, who was also fighting cancer. And when his mother passed in January 1991, something unexpected happened. Less than a year after Sydney's passing, Hamilton married his former hospice nurse in August 1991. The marriage moved Donna into Mount Athos and Glen Valley, a sprawling 345-acre estate in Orange County, Virginia, that had once been part of President James Madison's Montpelier property. Hamilton was a 57-year-old cattle farmer with a fortune estimated at $15 million. His 3 daughters from his first marriage watched as their former stepmother's caregiver became their new stepmother. The transition happened quickly, perhaps too quickly for some to process. For a decade, life at Mount Athos continued. But according to testimony that would later surface, the marriage began showing signs of strain. with suggestions of affairs on Donna's part and mentions of marriage counseling. Donna had left her nursing career years earlier, but returned to volunteer work as a hospice nurse about 6 months before November 2001. Why return to a profession she had walked away from? Why volunteer in a field that deals intimately with end-of-life medications? On November 13, 2001, Hamilton Somerville passed away at Mount Athos. Donna called rescue workers, but asked them to stop trying to resuscitate her husband and said she wanted his body cremated that night. The request was unusual. The urgency seemed out of place. His 3 daughters insisted on an autopsy. That decision changed everything. The autopsy revealed large amounts of morphine, codeine, oxycodone, and promethazine in Hamilton's stomach, blood, liver, and eye fluid. Virginia's chief medical examiner testified that Hamilton had ingested a truly impressive dose of drugs, stating that the combination was clearly lethal. The findings were impossible to ignore. A man who had lived his entire life on that estate was suddenly deceased from a massive overdose of medications typically found in hospice care. Donna Somerville was indicted by a special grand jury in November 2002 and charged with first-degree homicide by poisoning. Prosecutors asserted that she had been having extramarital affairs and that she had access to the drugs through her recent return to hospice nursing. They intended to call 6 men they claimed were romantically involved with her, though they struggled to provide testimony supporting that claim. One man exercised his Fifth Amendment rights and refused to answer questions. Another testified to one intimate encounter, but was himself facing felony charges being prosecuted by the same attorneys. Prosecutors argued that Donna stood to gain more from Hamilton's passing than from a divorce, especially if affairs were proven. Evidence showed that Hamilton's will left everything to his wife, and that he had placed both Mount Athos and his investment accounts in joint ownership. The financial picture was clear. In life, they shared everything. In his passing, she inherited everything. The trial took place in 2004 without a jury because the defense worried that extensive news coverage would prejudice local jurors. The defense argued that Hamilton either suffered a heart attack or took the lethal dosage on his own. Defense testimony based on hair samples from Hamilton suggested evidence of prolonged substance use. Attorney Charles Bowman questioned why Donna would call rescue workers if she were a cold-blooded killer. On June 29, 2004, Orange County Circuit Judge Daniel Bouton ruled that prosecutors had not proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt and acquitted Donna Somerville. Hamilton's 3 daughters embraced and wept when the verdict was announced. Alita Miller, the daughter who had insisted on the autopsy, said the judge did what he thought was right and that she had to try to find peace with it. But the story didn't end there. The daughters filed a wrongful death lawsuit in civil court. The standard isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but preponderance of the evidence. Retired Judge Robert Harris mediated the case and wrote that it was his opinion by preponderance of the evidence that Donna was liable. New data from the testing laboratory indicated that Hamilton's hair could have been contaminated by vomit-containing drugs expelled from his stomach, undermining the defense's argument about prolonged use. The settlement conveyed Mount Athos and Glen Valley to Hamilton's 3 daughters and required Donna to pay them $900,000, though $360,000 would go toward paying off a line of credit secured by the property. She had lived in that house since marrying Hamilton. The daughters hadn't set foot inside for 9 years. Now it finally belonged to them again. The case was later featured on the television show Snapped and fictionalized as a 2005 Lifetime movie titled Widow on the Hill. Today, Donna Somerville lives outside the estate she once called home, acquitted in criminal court, but found liable in civil proceedings. The woman who entered the Somerville family as a caregiver left it under a cloud that has never fully lifted. Amber Guyger. Picture this. You're sitting in your own living room after a long day, enjoying a simple bowl of ice cream. The door opens, a figure enters, and in seconds, everything ends. No warning, no chance to explain, just confusion, terror, and finality. This is exactly what happened to 26-year-old Botham Jean on the evening of September 6, 2018. But the person who walked through his door wasn't a stranger. It was his downstairs neighbor, a Dallas police officer. And the explanation she would give would spark a national conversation about accountability, judgment, and how a single moment of catastrophic error can destroy multiple lives forever. Amber Renee Guyger was 30 years old and working as a patrol officer in the Cedars district of South Dallas. She lived in apartment 1378 on the 3rd floor of Southside Flats, a 4-story building located just 2 blocks from Dallas Police Department headquarters. Directly above her, in apartment 1478, lived Botham Jean. Jean was a Harding University alumnus, born in St. Lucia, who worked as an accountant for PricewaterhouseCoopers. He was devoutly religious and had a deep interest in social justice, dreaming of one day returning to St. Lucia to run for prime minister. The two neighbors lived nearly identical floor plans, separated by a single level. That September evening, Guyger finished a 13-and-a-half-hour shift, leaving work at 9:33. She drove to the apartment complex, parking her vehicle in the garage on the 4th floor at 9:46. She was speaking on the phone with her romantic partner during her journey home, a conversation that lasted until 9:55. Exhaustion after her extended shift would later become part of her explanation for what happened next. According to an arrest warrant affidavit, Guyger told investigators she mistakenly parked on the 4th floor instead of the 3rd floor, which corresponded to her apartment. When she approached what she believed was her apartment, she found the door ajar and not latched closed. Guyger turned her key fob in the lock, which opened the door farther. Using her left arm, she pushed it open. She testified these events occurred in the span of 2 seconds. There was no light on inside, but she said she heard moving around inside and was scared. She pulled her weapon and yelled, "Let me see your hands. Let me see your hands." According to Guyger, the figure walked toward her at a fast pace, yelling, "Hey, hey, hey," in what she described as an aggressive voice. Guyger was off duty, but still in her police uniform when she fired twice with her service weapon. Botham Jean was eating ice cream on his couch. One round struck him in the chest. Moments after the shooting, Guyger realized she was in the wrong apartment. However, attorney Lee Merritt, representing Jean's family, later released details from at least 2 witnesses who claimed to have heard knocking on Jean's door, followed by the voice of a woman believed to be Guyger, saying, "Let me in, let me in." One witness said after hearing gunshots, she heard a male voice say, "Oh my God, why did you do that?" These accounts conflicted with Guyger's version. Residents also questioned her claim about the door being ajar. Multiple videos shared online showed how the key and door system worked at the complex, with one demonstrating that when you use the wrong key on a door, a red light flashes, and when at the right door, a green light flashes. 3 days later, on September 9th, an arrest warrant was issued for Guyger, charging her with manslaughter. She was released on $300,000 bond and placed on administrative leave. The initial charge sparked immediate public outcry. Jean's passing prompted protests and outrage as another example of a white officer ending the life of an unarmed black man. On September 24th, Dallas Police Chief Renee Hall announced Guyger had been fired after an internal affairs investigation concluded she engaged in adverse conduct. On November 30th, 2018, a Dallas County grand jury indicted Guyger on 1 count of ending a life. Jean's mother, Allison, told reporters, "I truly believe that she inflicted tremendous wrongdoing on my son. He didn't deserve it. He felt safe in that apartment and he was violated." Guyger pleaded not guilty. Her trial began on September 23, 2019, more than a year after the incident. Defense attorneys argued that Guyger made a regrettable but reasonable error, believing she had interrupted an intruder in her own home and using force to defend herself. The trial court's jury instructions included two separate statutory defenses under the Texas Penal Code: mistake of fact and self-defense. On October 1, 2019, the jury rejected both defenses and found Amber Guyger responsible. They assessed her punishment at 10 years confinement. During sentencing, prosecutors presented evidence aimed at revealing Guyger's character, including offensive social media posts. Following closing arguments, the jury handed down the 10-year sentence. She would be eligible for parole after 5 years. The sentence prompted reactions of frustration outside the courtroom. But inside, during an impact statement, Jean's younger brother offered a surprising moment of compassion. Guyger appealed her outcome, arguing that her mistaken belief that she was in her apartment negated her responsibility and that she had the right to use force in self-defense. The ruling was upheld on appeal twice in 2021. In October 2024, Guyger was denied parole. She was eligible for release in September, on what would have been Jean's 33rd birthday, after serving half of her sentence. On November 20, 2024, a civil trial jury awarded Jean's family $98.65 million, including about $60 million in punitive damages and $38.6 million in compensatory damages. The family said they would donate any damages they received to the Botham Jean Foundation and acknowledged they are unlikely to collect the full amount. Today, Amber Guyger serves her sentence, and Botham Jean's family continues seeking justice in his memory. The case remains a stark reminder of how quickly life can change, and how one person's mistake can echo through countless lives forever. Virginia Cordell. How quickly can someone cross the line from asking for help to committing the irreversible? On March 15, 1998, 39-year-old Virginia Cordell ran into an old friend, Jonathan Goforth, at a place where people gathered to use substances. She hadn't seen him in roughly 15 years. What started as a reunion between two people struggling with their own demons would end with a 73-year-old woman gone forever, and two people facing the harshest penalty Kentucky law could offer. Virginia Susan Cordell had a connection to the victim that made the crime even more difficult to comprehend. She was the former fiancée of Lynetta White's son. Cordell had recently moved out of the White family's house, following an argument with White's son over her substance use issues, which also led to their engagement ending. She knew where Lynetta lived. She knew the layout of the home. She knew this woman had welcomed her into the family. And on that March day, she went back. Goforth drove Virginia to the home of 73-year-old Lynetta White and asked for $20 to rent a room. When the elderly woman gave Virginia the money, Virginia spent it on substances and soon returned with Jonathan for more. Think about that for a moment. Lynetta White had every reason to turn them away. She could have closed her door, she could have refused, but she gave them money anyway, and they came back asking for more. This time, they attacked her with a hammer. The autopsy would later reveal that she had been struck with such force that parts of her skull had caved in from the blows. The woman who had shown kindness was met with something unimaginable. After the attack, both Cordell and Goforth ransacked the house and stole several valuables, including jewelry, 2 firearms, and a mink coat. But they weren't finished. They wrapped her body in a carpet and loaded it into the trunk of her own vehicle. They drove the car to an empty field, doused it with gasoline, and set it on fire. On March 15, 1998, firefighters and police responded to a car fire in an isolated field in Kentucky. When they extinguished the flames and opened the trunk, they found Lynetta White's remains. The investigation moved quickly. Within the first 48 hours, investigators located Virginia and picked her up on a misdemeanor warrant. She was interviewed, taken to jail, and bonded out quickly. During the interview, she denied anything to do with Lonetta's passing but gave investigators information that advanced the case. She also named Jonathan Goforth. But without enough evidence at that moment, both suspects walked free. Both Cordell and Goforth had fled Kentucky to other states, and warrants of arrest were issued for the pair, who both entered the wanted list as top sought-after fugitives. On October 31st, 1998, the documentary series, America's Most Wanted, covered the case of Lonetta White and sent out a public appeal for information about the whereabouts of both Cordell and Goforth. On November 12, 1998, it was reported that Virginia Cordell was arrested while detained at a facility in New Orleans, Louisiana, for unrelated theft charges under the alias Kelly Lyons. A fellow female detainee recognized Cordell as the alleged perpetrator mentioned in the show and alerted the authorities. The power of television had done what months of searching could not. The police continued to trace the whereabouts of Goforth after the capture of Cordell, who was extradited back to Kentucky to face charges. During questioning, Goforth claimed Cordell had been the one who struck Mrs. White with the hammer and that an unidentified person had assisted Cordell in committing the crimes. An assertion he admitted at trial was a fabrication. Cordell gave statements to police in which she admitted her presence at the scene of the crimes but named Goforth as the perpetrator. Each pointed at the other. Each tried to minimize their own role. But the physical evidence told its own story. At trial, both defendants blamed the other for masterminding the attack and delivering the fatal blow. The finger-pointing had little effect on judge and jury. Virginia and her accomplice were both found guilty of the charges, including robbery, burglary, arson, and tampering with physical evidence. The jury also recommended something that was extremely rare in Kentucky at that time. According to reports, the jury's unanimous recommendation for capital punishment was highly unusual, since it was extremely rare for white people to be sentenced in this manner by the jury for taking the life of an African American person. Two sisters of White were also present in the courtroom to hear the jury's sentencing decision. And White's youngest sister, May Penman, pointed out that both perpetrators should face the consequences for what happened to her older sister. On March 24, 2000, Fayette County Circuit Judge John Adams aligned with the jury's recommendation and formally sentenced both 39-year-old Jonathan Goforth and 39-year-old Virginia Cordell accordingly. Cordell was the first woman in Kentucky to receive this sentence since LaFonda Faye Foster had her penalty commuted to life without parole for taking the lives of 5 people in 1987. Following their sentencing, both argued that they were wrongfully convicted due to having ineffective attorneys. Virginia claimed that if an expert witness for the defense were called in to testify on certain evidence found at the scene, the outcome of her case would have been different. A federal judge rejected her appeal after concluding her attorney wasn't deficient at trial, and there wasn't any evidence a co-defendant acted on his own. Her appeals have been exhausted. Jonathan Goforth passed away while incarcerated on June 14, 2025. Virginia Cordell, who exhausted her appeals in 2019, continues to await her fate. She is also the only woman currently in this situation in Kentucky. While capital punishment remains legal in Kentucky, a moratorium has been in place since 2010 due to a court order. As of 2025, Cordell has not been assigned a date, as long as the court order remains in effect. Today, Virginia Cordell resides at the Kentucky Correctional Institute for Women in Pewee Valley. The woman who once knocked on Lonetta White's door asking for help now waits in a cell. Her future uncertain, but her past forever defined by those choices made on a March day in 1998.